Joining me now is Yaakov Katz, a senior columnist and former editor for the Jerusalem Post. Thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell us the latest situation on the ground now that Israeli forces have begun withdrawing from the Jenin refugee camp, please?
It seems that most of the IDF, the Israeli forces, have pulled out of the Jenin refugee camp where they've operated over the last few days, trying to dismantle terrorist infrastructure. They've pulled out. Palestinian Authority forces that have basically been absent from operating inside Jenin because of the rise of these militant and terrorist organizations that have taken over the camp. They started to go in late last night to try to regain some sort of control. And the people are beginning to come back as well, those who fled because of the ongoing fighting and the violence and a lot of the fierce shooting that was going on between some of the terrorists as well as the Israeli military. But they've pulled out. Israel says that it's discovered over 1,000 explosive devices. It's dismantled dozens of terrorist bases and hideouts. It's taken out about a dozen or so terrorists themselves and struck at some of those cells that were operating there. But it also says that this is not the end. This is the beginning. So while this operation might be over, I think we should expect that we will continue to see more of these rolling operations as Jenin continues to be a source of a lot of the terrorist attacks against Israel.
Unsurprisingly, the militants are also claiming victory because of the start of this withdrawal. But let me ask you this, has Israel achieved its objectives?
Look, these objectives are a little slippery, Anna, right? There's no clear goal necessarily. You could say we're going to defeat terror, right? The defeat of terrorism is not something that's necessarily attainable, especially when you're fighting against a terrorist entity or different organizations like Islamic Jihad, like Hamas and other groups that operate in Jenin that embed themselves inside civilian infrastructure. We've seen images of tunnels under mosques and weapons caches that have been discovered next to schools. There were improvised rockets that the groups were trying to create inside Jenin. We saw rocket fire from Gaza overnight with Israeli retaliation there. So just how closely connected those fronts are to one another. But I think that what we see is that from the Israeli perspective, what they wanted to do, Jenin had been the source of about 50 terrorist attacks over the last few months. Israel needed to go in there to try to dismantle as much of that terrorist infrastructure as possible while minimizing the harm to civilians. And I think Israel did a pretty good job at doing that. Some of the infrastructure, obviously, we can't say the same about, and that's because they had a lot of explosive devices lining streets. So Israel had to go in there and rip up some of those streets to prevent those explosive devices from going off. But you do see that there was pretty targeted strikes just against the terrorists and the militants themselves. But it's not over. These terrorists will come back. They will try to carry out more attacks, and Israel will be using pinpointed intelligence to go back in and try to take out and remove that threat as possible.
Yeah, I guess it is only a matter of time before the violence erupts again. Jenin, as we know, has the reputation as the centre of militant defiance.
It's 100% true. Unfortunately, this is the sad reality and the cycle that we live in here in Israel and in the wider Middle East of these constant rounds, of violence that take place here. But I think that really the question comes down to, what do the Palestinians want inside Jenin? What does the Palestinian Authority want? The Palestinian Authority is weak. It hasn't been present with its security forces inside Jenin. It's let the terrorist groups run rampant there. And therefore, Israel had no choice but to go in there and to try to stop those attacks. We saw an attack, for example, just yesterday in Tel Aviv, where a Palestinian 20-something-year-old rams a car into a group of civilians at a bus stop, takes out a knife, starts to stab some of those people. There are still a few of them who are wounded. One woman who was pregnant lost her child, her unborn child. These attacks, as long as they continue, Israel needs to find a way to be able to defend itself. It has that right like every other country. And that will mean having to go into places like Jenin, which is the source of this terrorism. And I think that sadly, as long as this continues, we are going to see these continued cycles of violence.
Yaakov Katz in Jerusalem. We appreciate the analysis. Many thanks.
Thank you.